pawn e4, pawn c5, knight f3, knight c6, pawn d4, pawn takes d4, knight takes d4, knight f6, knight c3, pawn d6, bishop c4, queen b6, knight d4, e2, pawn e6, castles kingside, bishop e7, bishop b3, castles kingside, king h1, knight a5, bishop g5, queen c5, pawn f4, pawn b5, knight g3, pawn b4, pawn e5, pawn takes e5, bishop takes f6, pawn takes f6, knight c3, e4, queen d4, queen h5, knight takes b3, queen h6, pawn takes f4, knight h5, pawn f5, rook a1, d1, queen e5, knight e4, f6, bishop takes f6, knight takes f6, queen takes f6, queen takes f6, knight c5, queen g5, king h8, queen e7, bishop a6, queen takes c5, bishop takes f1, rook takes f1, pawn e4, pawn c5, knight f3, pawn d6, pawn d4, pawn takes d4, knight takes d4, knight f6, knight c3, pawn a6, bishop g5, pawn e6, pawn f4, bishop e7, queen f3, queen c7, castles queenside, knight b8, d7, pawn g4, pawn b5, bishop takes f6, pawn takes f6, pawn f5, knight e5, queen h3, castles kingside, knight c3 e2, king h8, knight f4, rook g8, rook g1, pawn d5, pawn takes e6, pawn takes e4, knight d5, queen c5, knight takes e7, queen takes e7, knight f5, queen takes e6, queen h6, bishop d7, rook d6, knight takes g4, rook takes g4, queen takes f5, rook takes g8, rook takes g8, rook takes f6, queen d5, rook d6, queen f5, rook f6, queen g5, queen takes g5, rook takes g5, rook takes f7, bishop g4, king d2, bishop f3, king e3, rook g1, bishop h3, rook e1, king f4, bishop d1, king e5, pawn e3, bishop f5, rook g1, rook takes h7, king g8, rook c7, bishop g4, bishop takes g4, rook takes g4, rook c3, pawn e2, rook e3, rook g2, king d4, pawn e1, rook takes e1, rook takes c2, rook b1, king f7, pawn a3, king e6, pawn b3, rook takes h2, king c5, king d7, king b6, rook a2, king takes a6, rook takes a3, king b7, king d6, king b6, king d7, Pawn b4. Rook h3. Rook c1. Rook h8. King takes b5. Rook b8. King a4. Rook a8. King b3. Rook c8. Rook takes c8. King takes c8. King c4. King b8. King c5. King c7. King b5. King b7. Pawn e4. Pawn c5. Knight f3. Knight c6. Pawn d4. Pawn takes d4. Knight takes d4. Knight f6. Knight c3. Pawn d6. Bishop c4. Bishop d7. Bishop b3. Pawn g6. Pawn f3. Knight a5. Bishop g5. Bishop g7. Queen d2. Pawn h6. Bishop e3. Rook c8. Castles queenside. Knight c4. Queen e2. Knight takes e3. Queen takes e3. Castles kingside. Pawn g4. Queen a5. Pawn h4. Pawn e6. Knight d4, e2. Rook c6. Pawn g5. Pawn takes g5. Pawn takes g5. Knight h5. Pawn f4. Rook f8, c8. King b1. Queen b6. Queen f3. Rook c5. Queen d3. Bishop takes c3. Knight takes c3. Knight takes f4. Queen f3. Knight h5. Rook takes h5. Pawn takes h5. Queen takes h5. Bishop e8. Queen h6. Rook takes c3. Pawn takes c3. Rook takes c3. Pawn g6. Pawn takes g6. Rook h1. Queen d4. Queen h7. Pawn e4. Pawn c5. Knight f3. Pawn d6. Pawn d4. Pawn takes d4. Knight takes d4. Knight f6. Knight c3. Pawn a6. Bishop g5. Pawn e6. Pawn f4. Bishop e7. Queen f3. Queen c7. Castles queenside. Knight b8, d7. Bishop e2. Pawn b5. Bishop takes f6. Knight takes f6. Pawn e5. Bishop b7. Pawn takes f6. Bishop takes f3. Bishop takes f3. Bishop takes f6. Bishop takes a8. Pawn d5. Bishop takes d5. Bishop takes d4. Rook takes d4. Pawn takes d5. Knight takes d5. Queen c5. Rook e1. King f8. Pawn c3. Pawn h5. Pawn f5. Rook h6. Pawn f6. Pawn takes f6. Knight f4. Pawn h4. Rook d8. King g7. Rook e1, e8. Queen g1. King d2. Queen f2. Knight e2. Rook g6. Pawn g3. Pawn f5. Rook g8. King f6. Rook takes g6. Pawn takes g6. Pawn takes h4. Queen takes h2. Rook d4. Queen h1. King c2. King e5. Pawn a4. Queen f1. Knight c1. Queen g2. King b3. Pawn takes a4. King a3. Queen c2. Knight d3. King f6. Knight c5. Queen c1. Rook takes a4. Queen e3. Knight takes a6. Pawn f4. Rook d4. King f5. Knight b4. Queen e7. King b3. Queen takes h4. Knight d3. Pawn g5. Pawn c4. Queen g3. Pawn c5. Pawn f3. King c4. Pawn f2. Knight takes f2. Queen takes f2. Pawn c6. Queen takes b2. King c5. Queen c3. King d5. Pawn g4. Rook c4. Queen e5. Pawn e4. Pawn c5. Knight f3. Pawn d6. Pawn d4. Pawn takes d4. Knight takes d4. Knight f6. Knight c3. Pawn a6. Bishop g5. Pawn e6. Pawn f4. Bishop e7. Queen f3. Queen c7. Castles queenside. Knight b8, d7. Pawn g4. Pawn b5. Bishop takes f6. Knight takes f6. Pawn g5. Knight d7. Bishop h3. Pawn b4. Knight c3, e2. Bishop b7. King b1. Knight c5. Knight g3. Pawn d5. Pawn f5. Pawn takes e4. Queen g4. Pawn takes f5. Knight d4 takes f5. Pawn g6. Knight takes e7. Queen takes e7. Queen f4. Castles kingside. Rook d6. Rook a8, d8. Rook f6. Rook d5. Bishop g4. Knight d7. Rook f1. Pawn e3. Pawn b3. Rook d2. Bishop takes d7. Rook takes d7. Rook e1. Rook e8. Pawn h4. Queen c5. Queen c4. Queen takes c4. Pawn takes c4. Rook d4. Pawn c5. Rook takes h4. Pawn c6. Bishop c8. Rook d6. Rook c4. King b2. King g7. King b3. Rook g4. Knight e2. Rook e6. Rook e1, d1. Rook g2. Knight f4. Rook takes d6. Rook takes d6. Rook d2. Rook d3. Rook f2. Rook d4. Pawn e2. Knight d3. Bishop f5. Pawn c7. Rook f3. Pawn c8. Bishop takes c8. Rook e4. Bishop f5. Rook takes e2. Bishop takes d3. Pawn takes d3. Rook takes d3. King takes b4. Rook d5. Rook g2. Pawn h6. Pawn takes h6. King takes h6. Pawn a4. Pawn g5. Rook c2. Rook d6. King c5. Rook e6. Pawn e4. Pawn c6. Knight c3. Pawn d5. Knight f3. Bishop g4. Pawn h3. Bishop takes f3. Queen takes f3. Knight f6. Pawn d3. Pawn e6. Pawn g3. Bishop b4. Bishop d2. Pawn d4. Knight b1. Bishop takes d2. Knight takes d2. Pawn e5. Bishop g2. Pawn c5. Castles kingside. Knight c6. Queen e2. Queen e7. Pawn f4. Castles queenside. Pawn a3. Knight e8. Pawn b4. Pawn takes b4. Knight c4. Pawn f6. Pawn takes e5. Pawn takes e5. Pawn takes b4. Knight c7. Knight a5. Knight b5. Knight takes c6. Pawn takes c6. Rook f2. Pawn g6. Pawn h4. King b7. Pawn h5. Queen takes b4. Rook f7. King b6. Queen f2. Pawn a5. Pawn c4. Knight c3. Rook f1. Pawn a4. Queen f6. Queen c5. Rook takes h7. Rook d8, f8. Queen takes g6. Rook takes f1. Bishop takes f1. Rook takes h7. Queen takes h7. Pawn a3. Pawn h6. Pawn a2. Queen g8. Pawn A1, pawn H7, queen D6, pawn H8, queen A7, pawn G4, king C5, queen F8, queen A7, E7, queen A8, king B4, queen H2, king B3, queen A1, queen A3, queen takes A3, king takes A3, queen H6, queen F7, king G2, king B3, queen D2, queen H7, king G3, queen takes E4, queen F2, queen H1, pawn E4, pawn C5, knight F3, pawn D6, pawn D4, pawn takes D4, knight takes D4, knight F6, knight C3, pawn A6, bishop C4, pawn E6, bishop B3, pawn B5, pawn F4, pawn B4, knight A4, knight takes E4, castles kingside, pawn G6, pawn F5, pawn G6 takes F5, knight takes F5, rook G8, bishop D5, rook A7, bishop takes E4, pawn takes F5, bishop takes F5, rook E7, bishop takes C8, queen takes C8, bishop F4, queen C6, queen F3, queen takes A4, bishop takes D6, queen C6, bishop takes B8, queen B6, king H1, queen takes b8, Queen c6, Rook d7, Rook a1, e1, Bishop e7, Rook takes f7, King takes f7, Queen e6, King f8, Queen takes d7, Queen d6, Queen b7, Rook g6, Pawn c3, Pawn a5, Queen c8, King g7, Queen c4, Bishop d8, Pawn takes b4, Pawn takes b4, Pawn g3, Queen c6, Rook e4, Queen takes c4, Rook takes c4, Rook b6, King g2, King f6, King f3, King e5, King e3, Bishop g5, King e2, King d5, King d3, Bishop f6, Rook c2, Bishop e5, Rook e2, Rook f6, Rook c2, Rook f3, King e2, Rook f7, King d3, Bishop d4, Pawn a3, Pawn b3, Rook c8, Bishop takes b2, Rook d8, King c6, Rook b8, Rook f3, King c4, Rook c3, King b4, King c7, Rook b5, Bishop a1, Pawn a4, Pawn b2, King takes c3, Pawn b1, Pawn e4, Pawn e5, Pawn f4, Pawn takes f4, Knight f3, Pawn g5, pawn h4, pawn g4, knight e5, knight f6, pawn d4, pawn d6, knight d3, knight takes e4, bishop takes f4, bishop g7, knight c3, knight takes c3, pawn takes c3, pawn c5, bishop e2, pawn takes d4, castles kingside, knight c6, bishop takes g4, castles kingside, bishop takes c8, rook takes c8, queen g4, pawn f5, queen g3, pawn takes c3, rook a1, e1, king h8, king h1, rook g8, bishop takes d6, bishop f8, bishop e5, knight takes e5, queen takes e5, rook g7, rook takes f5, queen takes h4, king g1, queen g4, rook f2, bishop e7, rook e4, queen g5, queen d4, rook f8, rook e5, rook d8, queen e4, queen h4, rook f4, queen g3, rook takes e7, pawn d4, knight f6, knight f3, pawn d5, pawn e3, pawn g6, pawn c4, bishop g7, knight c3, castles kingside, queen b3, pawn e6, bishop e2, knight c6, queen c2, pawn takes c4, bishop takes c4, pawn e5. Pawn takes e5. Knight g4. Castles kingside. Knight c6 takes e5. Knight takes e5. Knight takes e5. Bishop e2. Pawn c6. Pawn f4. Knight g4. Pawn h3. Bishop f5. Pawn e4. Queen d4. King h1. Knight f2. Rook takes f2. Queen takes f2. Pawn takes f5. Bishop takes c3. Pawn takes c3. Rook a8, e8. Bishop d3. Rook e1. King h2. Queen g1. King g3. Rook f8, e8. Rook b1. Pawn takes f5. Bishop d2. Rook takes b1. Queen takes b1. Queen takes b1. Bishop takes b1. Rook e2. Bishop c1. Rook e1. Pawn e4. Pawn c6. Pawn d4. Pawn d5. Pawn takes d5. Pawn takes d5. Pawn c4. Knight f6. Knight c3. Knight c6. Knight f3. Bishop g4. Pawn takes d5. Knight takes d5. Queen b3. Bishop takes f3. Pawn takes f3. Pawn e6. Queen takes b7. Knight takes d4. Bishop b5. Knight takes b5. Queen c6. King e7. Queen takes b5. Knight takes c3. Pawn takes c3. Queen d7. Rook b1. Rook d8. Bishop e3. Queen takes b5. Rook takes b5. Rook d7. King e2. Pawn f6. Rook d1. Rook takes d1. King takes d1. King d7. Rook b8. King c6. Bishop takes a7. Pawn g5. Pawn a4. Bishop g7. Rook b6. King d5. Rook b7. Bishop f8. Rook b8. Bishop g7. Rook b5. King c6. Rook b6. King d5. Pawn a5. Pawn f5. Bishop b8. Rook c8. Pawn a6. Rook takes c3. Rook b5. King c4. Rook b7. Bishop d4. Rook c7. King d3. Rook takes c3. King takes c3. Bishop e5. Bishop takes e5. Pawn a7.